Hello there, and welcome to Earth's history, where we trace the footsteps of ancient explorers, where courage and necessity intertwine, where one of the most audacious journeys ever undertaken transformed life forever. Tonight, we're witnessing one of the greatest adventures in the history of life on Earth. The moment when our ancestors left the water and walked onto land, when fins became limbs, when gills became lungs, when creatures that had lived in oceans for hundreds of millions of years took their first tentative steps into an alien world. This is the story of the transition from water to land, of the fish that became tetrapods, of pioneers like Tiktaalik who lived in the shallow waters between two worlds, of the evolutionary innovation that made life on land possible, of the brave individuals who ventured into an environment that had never known vertebrate life. It's the story of why they left the safety of the water, what they found on the barren shore, and how their descendants, including you, came to dominate the terrestrial world. If you've ever stood at the edge of the ocean and felt the pull between two worlds, if you've ever wondered how your ancestors made the journey from sea to land, if you've ever marveled at your own hands and feet and lungs and realized their modified versions of structures that once served completely different purposes in the water, you're about to discover something profound. You are a fish, in a very real sense. A fish that learned to walk, to breathe air, to live in a world of gravity and desiccation and temperature. Your arms are modified fin. Your lungs are modified swim bladder. Your entire body plan is an ancient aquatic design adapted for terrestrial life. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable, ready to journey back 375 million years to the late Devonian period, to the tidal flat and shallow stream where the first tetrapods emerged. Maybe you're lying in bed, feeling the weight of gravity holding you down, the air flowing in and out of your lungs. Maybe you're sitting quietly as evening settles around you. Maybe you're in that peaceful space where you can imagine yourself as one of those ancient pioneers, feeling water and air, mud and rock, navigating between two worlds. If this journey into our aquatic past brings you wonder, if it helps you understand the remarkable transformation that made your terrestrial existence possible, if it makes you appreciate the courage of those ancient explorers, not conscious courage, but the evolutionary bravery of venturing into the unknown, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone else who finds meaning in understanding where we came from. Settle in. Let your breathing slow like the gentle rhythm of waves on ancient shore. Let your thoughts drift like a fish in shallow water, feeling sunlight from above and mud below. And let's begin. Because somewhere in the Devonian period, about 375 million years ago, in the shallow waters of what is now Arctic Canada, there lived a creature that was neither quite fish nor quite tetrapod, a pioneer caught between two worlds, doing something that would change the course of evolution forever. Its name was Tiktaalik, and tonight we're going to meet it. Before we can understand why vertebrates left the water, we need to understand the world they were leaving and the world they were entering. We need to see what the late Devonian period was like, what opportunities and dangers existed, what pressures might drive fish to venture onto land. The Devonian period lasted from about 419 to 359 million years ago, and it's often called the Age of Fishes because this was when fish diversified explosively, when they evolved into countless forms, when they dominated the waters of the earth. The oceans, lakes, and rivers of the Devonian were full of fish. Armored placoderms with bony plates covering their heads and front body, sleek sharks with cartilaginous skeletons, ray-finned fish that would eventually give rise to most modern fish, and lobe-finned fish, the group that would eventually produce tetrapod. The lobe-finned fish, or Sarcopterygian, are particularly important to our story. Unlike ray-finned fish, whose fins are supported by thin, flexible rays, lobe-finned fish had fins with a fleshy, muscular base containing bone. These bones, the humerus, radius, ulna in the front fin, femur, tibia, fibula in the back fin, are the same bones you have in your arms and legs, just arranged differently, shaped for different purposes. In the Devonian, lobe-finned fish included several groups. The coelacanths, ancient fish that still exist today in deep ocean waters, largely unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. The lungfish, which can breathe air using modified swim bladders that function as lungs, which can survive in oxygen-poor water or even in mud during dry season. And the tetrapodomorphs, the group most closely related to tetrapods, fish that were moving toward a more terrestrial lifestyle. These tetrapodomorph fish lived primarily in freshwater environments, rivers, streams, lakes, swamps, In tropical and subtropical regions, the Devonian climate was generally warm, without polar ice caps, with high sea level. The continents were arranged differently than today, with much of the land concentrated in two large masses, Gondwana in the south and Euramerica in the north, with smaller continents scattered between. The freshwater environments where tetrapodomorphs lived were dynamic, challenging places. Water levels fluctuated with season. Wet seasons when rivers ran high and flooded the surrounding landscape. Dry seasons when water retreated, leaving pools that might become stagnant. Oxygen poor, even completely dried out. Temperature varied, sometimes dramatically. Predators were abundant. Large predatory fish, armored placoderms with powerful jaws, even giant arthropods in some environments. The land, by contrast, was beginning to transform. Earlier in Earth's history, land had been barren, lifeless, except for microbial mats, and perhaps some hardy lichens and early plants. But by the Devonian, plants had evolved considerably. The early Devonians saw simple plants, small, no more than a meter tall, without true leaves or deep roots. But by the late Devonian, forests existed, with trees like Archaeopteris reaching 30 meters tall, with extensive root systems, stabilizing soils, with canopies creating shade and complex terrestrial habitat. These forests, though different in composition from modern forests, supported diverse life. Arthropods had colonized land long before vertebrates. Millipedes, centipedes, primitive insects, arachnids, even giant arthropods like Arthropleura that would grow to over 2 meters long in the later Carboniferous. These arthropods fed on decaying plant matter, on fungal growth, on each other, creating the first terrestrial food webs. So the late Devonian land wasn't completely barren. It had plants, had arthropods, had food sources and habitat, but it lacked vertebrates. No amphibians, no reptiles, no mammals or birds. These would all come later. The land was waiting, in a sense, for vertebrates to discover it, to adapt to it, to evolve the innovations necessary to exploit its opportunities. What might drive fish to venture out of the water onto this land? Several factors probably contributed, creating pressures that favored individuals capable of moving between aquatic and terrestrial environments. First, competition. The Devonian waters were crowded with fish of all kinds, all competing for food, space, breeding sites. Predation was intense. Large predatory fish could grow to enormous sizes, and they hunted the smaller fish, including the lobe-finned tetrapodomorph. Any strategy that allowed fish to escape competition, to access resources others couldn't reach, would be advantageous. Second, oxygen. Many Devonian freshwater environments were prone to becoming oxygen poor, especially during warm seasons when water warmed up and couldn't hold as much dissolved oxygen, or when plant growth died back and decomposed, consuming oxygen. Fish living in these environments faced suffocation. The ability to breathe air, to take oxygen directly from the atmosphere, rather than depending on dissolved oxygen in water, would be a life-saving adaptation. Third, stranding. In seasonal environments with fluctuating water level, fish could easily become stranded in pools that were drying up, cut off from the main river or lake. Fish that could only breathe water would suffocate as the water disappeared. Fish that could survive brief periods out of water, that could move across land to reach new water sources, would survive where others died. Fourth, food. The terrestrial environment was beginning to fill with arthropods, insects, millipedes, spiders, all of which were potential food sources. A fish that could venture onto land, even briefly, could feed on these arthropods without competition from other fish. This would be particularly advantageous if aquatic food sources were scarce, or if the fish was small and struggled to compete with larger predators in the water. Fifth, breeding. Shallow water, the margins of ponds and streams, were ideal breeding sites for many fish. Warm water, rich in food for young, with plants providing shelter. But these margins were also crowded, competitive, dangerous with predators. The ability to breed in very shallow water, or even in temporarily water-filled depressions on land, might reduce competition and predation on eggs and young. These pressures didn't suddenly appear in the late Devonian. They'd been present for millions of years, shaping the evolution of lobe-finned fish, favoring traits that allowed them to cope with challenging aquatic environments. Stronger fins for pushing through vegetation, or moving in shallow water, lungs for breathing air when water was oxygen poor, eyes that could see in both water and air, bodies that could tolerate temperature and salinity changes. By the late Devonian, around 375 million years ago, some lobe-finned fish had evolved to the point where they were effectively living between two worlds, spending most of their time in water, but regularly venturing into very shallow water or briefly onto land, using their muscular fins to prop themselves up, their lungs to breathe air, their specialized eyes to see in both environments. One of these transitional creatures was Tiktaalik roseae, discovered in 2004 on Ellesmere Island in Arctic Canada by paleontologists Neil Shubin, Ted Deichler, and Farish Jenkins. The fossils of Tiktaalik are beautifully preserved, showing exquisite details of the skeleton, and they represent one of the most important transitional fossils ever found, a creature that captures the moment when fish were becoming tetrapods. Let's meet Tiktaalik. Try to understand what it was like, how it lived, what it tells us about the transition from water to land. Tiktaalik was about 1.5 to 2.75 meters long, roughly the size of a large crocodile. It had a flat, broad head with eyes on the top, similar to a crocodile, suggesting it lived in shallow water and perhaps spent time looking up toward the surface or the air. Its snout was elongated, with large teeth capable of seizing prey, likely other fish, possibly arthropods. The most remarkable feature of Tiktaalik is its fin, particularly its pectoral fin, the front fin. These fins are clearly transitional between the fins of fish and the limbs of tetrapods. Inside, they have bones that correspond to the humerus, radius, and ulna of your arm, the same bones in the same arrangement, but the fin also has fin rays at the end, like a fish, rather than separate fingers. Critically, Tiktaalik's pectoral fins had wrist-like joints. The fin could bend in the middle, could support weight, could be used to prop the animal up in shallow water or perhaps on land. The shoulder was detached from the skull, unlike in most fish where the shoulder girdle is fused to the back of the skull. This detachment allowed the head to move independently, to turn and lift, essential for an animal moving in shallow water or on land where you need to look around without turning your whole body. Tiktaalik had a neck, one of the first vertebrates to have a distinct neck. Fish don't have necks. Their heads are rigidly connected to their bodies, but tetrapods need necks to move their heads independently. Tiktaalik's neck was short, but it was there, allowing some head movement, another step toward terrestrial life. The ribs of Tiktaalik were substantial, capable of supporting the body against gravity. In fish, ribs are small, not weight-bearing. Water supports the body, but on land, gravity pulls down, and the body needs structural support. Tiktaalik's ribs show this transition, stronger than typical fish ribs, but not yet as robust as later tetrapod ribs. Tiktaalik had lungs. We can infer this from related species, and from the internal anatomy. Like modern lungfish, it probably had functional lungs that allowed air breathing, supplementing or replacing gill breathing when necessary. It also had gills, still visible in the fossils, indicating it could breathe water as well. This dual respiratory system was perfect for a transitional lifestyle, allowing the animal to breathe in both water and air. The tail of Tiktaalik was fish-like, with fin rays, indicating it still swam like a fish when in deeper water. But the body proportions, the flat shape, the strong fins all suggest it spent considerable time in very shallow water, perhaps moving through vegetation, perhaps venturing onto mudflats or shoreline. Where did Tiktaalik live? The fossils come from ancient river deposits in what is now Arctic Canada. In the Devonian, this region was much warmer, located near the equator, with a tropical climate. It was a landscape of meandering rivers, floodplains, shallow channels, areas that would have been very shallow, or periodically exposed to air. This is exactly the environment where you'd expect to find transitional form. Not in the deep ocean, not in stable lake, but in dynamic, shallow waters, where the boundary between aquatic and terrestrial was blurred, where advantages could accrue to animals capable of operating in both realms. Tiktaalik wasn't alone. There were other transitional forms, other fish exploring the boundary between water and land. Pandorictus, from slightly earlier in the Devonian, had similar features. Flat body, strong fins, eyes on top, suggesting a similar lifestyle. Elpistostage, discovered more recently, was even more tetrapod-like, with fin bones that included distinct digit-like structure. These creatures represent a progression, a series of evolutionary experiments in the transition to land. Each was successful in its own time, adapted to its specific environment. They weren't trying to become tetrapods, weren't working towards some future goal. They were just living, just adapting to their circumstances, just exploiting the opportunities available in shallow dynamic water. But their adaptation, accumulated over millions of years, over thousands of generations, We're preparing the way for a complete transition to land, for the evolution of true tetrapods, for vertebrates that could live their entire lives out of water. Let's imagine what it was like to be Tiktaalik, to live between two worlds, to navigate the challenges of an amphibious lifestyle. You're lying in shallow water, perhaps only a few centimeters deep, in the muddy margin of a slow-moving river. The water is warm, almost bath-like, heated by the tropical sun. It's murky, full of suspended sediment, decaying plant matter. Visibility is poor. You can barely see a body length ahead, but you're not relying primarily on vision underwater. You have a lateral line system, the same sensory organ fish use to detect pressure changes, movements in the water. This tells you when other fish are nearby, when something is moving, when potential prey or predators are approaching. You feel the flow of water across your body, weak here in the margins, but present, indicating which direction is downstream. You adjust your position using your strong pectoral fins to prop yourself up, to push against the muddy bottom. The fins flex, the wrist-like joints allowing you to maneuver even in water so shallow that a typical fish would be stuck. The water here is oxygen poor. It's warm, stagnant, with decomposing vegetation consuming what little oxygen there is. Your gills can extract some oxygen, but not enough. You need air. You lift your head. You can do this, unlike most fish, because you have a neck, because your skull isn't fused to your shoulder. Your eyes, positioned on top of your head, break the surface. The air is bright, dazzling after the murky water. You can see above the water now, a different world, a realm of light and clarity. You open your mouth, draw in air. It flows past your gills. You can extract oxygen from air as well as from water, and into your lungs, filling them, providing the oxygen your tissues desperately need. You hold the air for a moment, extracting oxygen, then release it, exhaling bubbles that rise through the shallow water. This is routine for you, something you do many times a day, every day. You're not thinking about it, not aware of its evolutionary significance. You're just breathing, just staying alive in an environment that would suffocate many other fish. You scan the shore while your head is above water. Movement catches your eye. Arthropods, millipedes perhaps, moving through the leaf litter at the water's edge. Their potential food, rich in nutrients, undefended compared to the armored and spiny fish you usually eat. You push forward with your fin, feeling the mud beneath you, the water barely covering your body. You're almost beached now, your belly touching mud, only your back still submerged. This is uncomfortable. Gravity pulls at you in a way it doesn't in deeper water. Your body weight, usually supported by water's buoyancy, now presses down on your belly, on your fin. But you can tolerate this, at least briefly. Your ribs provide some support. Your strong fins can prop you up slightly, taking some weight. And the reward, the millipede you're stalking, makes the discomfort worthwhile. You lunge, using your fins to push, to propel yourself forward. It's not elegant, not like swimming. It's more like a crawl, a push, a heave. Your body flexes. Your tail provides some thrust, even in the shallow water. You cover the distance quickly, despite the awkwardness. Your jaws close on the millipede. It's crunchy, struggling, not like the soft-bodied fish you usually eat, but it's food, easily caught, undefended. You swallow, feel it slide down your throat, but now you're further onto land than you intended, almost completely out of water. The air is drying your skin, and you can feel yourself losing moisture. Your gills, exposed to air, are collapsing, becoming useless. You need to get back to water quickly. You push with your fins, drag your body, feel the mud sliding beneath you. It's exhausting, this movement on land, so much harder than swimming, but you make progress, sliding back toward the water, feeling it envelop your body again, cool and familiar. You settle back into the shallow, panting, breathing hard. Your gills extract oxygen from the water again, now that they're submerged. Your lungs supplement, drawing air from above. Your body relaxed, supported by water, gravity no longer pulling so heavily. This is your life, lived at the boundary between water and land. You're not fully aquatic. You can't survive in deep water, can't compete with the fast-swimming predators, but you're not fully terrestrial either. You can't stay on land for long, can't venture far from water. You're in between, exploiting a niche that few others can access. Successful, precisely because you can navigate both worlds. You don't know it, but you're part of something historic, something transformative. Your descendants, thousands of generations from now, will be fully terrestrial, will walk on land with confidence, will breathe air exclusively, will never return to water except to drink or to hunt. But those descendants depend on you, on your adaptation, on your ability to survive in this challenging transitional environment. This is the life of Tiktaalik and of the other transitional forms like it. It's not a comfortable life, not an easy one, but it's viable, it's successful, and it's paving the way for an entirely new realm of evolutionary possibility. The transition from fins to limbs is one of the most studied and best understood examples of evolutionary transformation. It's not mysterious, not miraculous. It's a gradual modification of existing structure, each step functional, each providing advantages in specific environments. Let's trace this transition, starting with the fins of lobe-finned fish and ending with the limbs of early tetrapods. Lobe-finned fish, like the coelacanth, have fins with a fleshy, muscular base containing bones. These bones are arranged in a specific pattern. A single bone, the humerus in the front fin, the femur in the back fin, connects to the body. This bone connects to two bones, radius and ulna in front, tibia and fibula in back. These connect to many small bones, which connect to fin rays. This pattern is already similar to the tetrapod limb. The main difference is that in fish, the bones are all internal to the fin, all enclosed in flesh and skin, and the fin rays extend beyond the bones, providing the surface area for swimming. In transitional forms like Pandoricthus and Tiktaalik, the pattern persists, but the proportions change. The single bone becomes longer, stronger. The two bones also elongate and strengthen. The wrist or ankle region develops more flexibility, more range of motion. The fin rays become reduced. The function of these modified fins changes from purely swimming to swimming plus support. The fish can use the fins to prop itself up on the bottom, to push against obstacles, to move through shallow water where swimming is impossible. Natural selection favors stronger fins, more flexible joints, bones that can bear weight. In forms like Elpistostege, even more advanced, the bones at the end of the fin begin to separate into distinct elements, not quite fingers yet, but digit-like structures, separate rays that could move independently. The fin is becoming a limb, though it's still encased in a fin-like structure, still used primarily in water. And then we get to true tetrapods, animals like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega from the late Devonian, just a bit later than Tiktaalik. These creatures had hands and feet, with separate digits, 8 digits on the front limbs in Acanthostega, more in some other early tetrapods, eventually stabilizing at 5 in later tetrapods, including the lineage leading to Us. These digits weren't paddle-like or webbed like fish fin. They were separate, movable, capable of gripping, of pushing against surfaces, of manipulating the environment. They were true hands and feet, recognizable as limbs even though they were still used primarily in water, even though these early tetrapods were still largely aquatic. At the genetic level, this transformation involved modifications to developmental genes, particularly Hox genes that control body patterning and limb development. Small changes to when and where these genes are expressed, how strongly they're active, what other genes they interact with. These changes can have large effects on the structure of the developing limb. Researchers have studied limb development in modern fish, amphibians, and other tetrapods, identifying the genetic pathways involved. They've found that the genes for making limbs already existed in fish. They're used to make fins. Tetrapod limbs don't require new genes, just modifications to how existing genes are deployed. This is a common pattern in evolution. Major transformations often don't require completely new genetic material. They require modifications to existing genes, changes in regulation, tweaks to developmental timing. The raw material is already there, inherited from ancestors. Evolution works with what's available, modifying, repurposing, optimizing for new function. The fin-to-limb transition is elegant evidence for evolution, for the gradual transformation of structures through natural selection. We have fossils showing the intermediate stages. We understand the genetic mechanism. We can see the same bones, just modified, in fish fins and tetrapod limbs. It's not a mystery. It's a well-documented transformation, one of the clearest examples of macroevolution we have. But let's not lose sight of the individual experience, the lived reality of this transformation. For Tiktaalik, for the transitional forms, these weren't abstract evolutionary changes. These were the structures they used to survive, to feed, to escape predators, to move through their world. The fin limbs that seem so remarkable to us were simply their appendages, the tools they were born with, adapted to their specific lifestyle. Now let's talk about breathing, about one of the most critical adaptations for terrestrial life, the ability to extract oxygen from air rather than water. This transition is in some ways easier to understand than the fin-to-limb transition, because many modern fish can breathe air to some degree. Lungfish obviously have lungs, but so do many other fish. In modified forms, some fish gulp air at the surface and extract oxygen in their gut. Others have vascularized swim bladders that function as crude lungs. Still others use their skin for gas exchange when exposed to air. The key insight is that lungs are modified swim bladders, or perhaps more accurately, swim bladders, and lungs share a common origin. In early bony fish, there were paired outpocketings from the gut that became gas-filled structures, serving as buoyancy control organs, swim bladders. In some lineages, particularly the lobe-finned fish, these structures became more vascularized, more capable of gas exchange, evolving into lungs. So lungs didn't evolve for terrestrial life. They evolved in aquatic environment, probably as an adaptation for living in oxygen-poor water, allowing fish to gulp air and extract oxygen when water oxygen was insufficient. This is what modern lungfish do. They live in seasonal waters that can become stagnant, and they breathe air to survive when water oxygen drops too low. Tiktaalik and related transitional forms almost certainly had functional lungs. They lived in similar environment, warm, shallow waters prone to becoming oxygen poor. The ability to breathe air would have been essential for survival, allowing them to remain in environments where other fish would suffocate. But lungs alone aren't sufficient for prolonged air breathing. You also need ways to move air in and out. Ventilation. Fish that breathe air typically gulp it at the surface, swallow it, extract oxygen in the gut or lungs, then release it. This works, but is inefficient. Tetrapods evolved more efficient ventilation mechanisms. Early tetrapods probably used buccal pumping, using the mouth and throat to pump air into the lungs, similar to what modern amphibians do. You open your mouth, lower your throat to draw air in, close your mouth, raise your throat to push air into the lungs. It's not as efficient as the diaphragm-driven breathing of mammals or the air sac system of birds, but it worked, providing adequate oxygenation for a moderately active lifestyle. The evolution of efficient air breathing was gradual, with each improvement providing advantages. Better air breathing allowed longer periods out of water, more vigorous activity, survival in more oxygen-poor environments. Over millions of years, over countless generations, the respiratory system was refined, optimized for terrestrial life. But let's imagine the experience, the first breath of air by an ancient tetrapod, the moment when air breathing became the primary mode of respiration rather than a supplement. You're an early tetrapod, perhaps Acanthostega, living about 365 million years ago in what is now Greenland. You're in a shallow lagoon, warm and murky, with dense vegetation, primitive plants growing in the water and extending onto the shore. The water here is familiar, comfortable, where you've spent your entire life. But the water is oxygen poor, especially during this hot season. Even with your lungs, even breathing air frequently, you're struggling. Your gills are marginally useful. The water is so deoxygenated that even perfect gills couldn't extract enough oxygen. You've been venturing onto land more frequently, dragging yourself into the shallows, onto mudflats, anywhere you can breathe air more easily. It's uncomfortable. Your skin dries. Your body feels heavy. Movement is exhausting, but it's necessary. Today, you've moved further onto land than ever before. You're resting in moist mud in the shade of primitive plants, completely out of water. Your gills are useless here, collapsed, dry. You can breathe only with your lungs. You open your mouth, lower your throat, feel air rush in. It's different from water, lighter, less resistant, carrying different scents. You can smell things in air that you could never smell in water. The vegetation, the mud, something else. Something you'll eventually learn is the scent of arthropod, potential food. You close your mouth, contract your throat, push the air down into your lung. They fill, expand, the oxygen diffusing across the thin tissues into your bloodstream. Your heart pumps, circulating the oxygenated blood to your tissues, to your muscles and brain and organ. You release the breath, opening your mouth, letting the deoxygenated air escape. Then you repeat, draw in, push down, release. Draw in, push down, release. It becomes rhythmic, automatic, this air breathing, this ventilation of your lungs, and you realize, in whatever dim awareness you have, that this is better. The air has more oxygen than the water ever did. Your tissues are well oxygenated for the first time in days, maybe weeks. You feel stronger, more alert, less desperate. You lie there, breathing air, resting on land, and something shifts. This isn't a temporary refuge, not just a desperate measure during oxygen-poor condition. This is viable. This is sustainable. You could live like this, on land, breathing air. If only you could solve the other problem: desiccation, locomotion, food. Predators. This is the moment of transition, not for your species that will take thousands more generations, but for you as an individual. You've crossed a threshold, discovered that land is not just hostile, not just a place to avoid, but potentially habitable, potentially home. You don't return to the water that day. The sun sets, the air cools, the moisture in the mud keeps your skin from drying too badly. You breathe air all night, sleep fitfully in this strange environment, wake to find yourself still alive, still functional. The next day, you experiment. You move, not back to water, but along the shore, exploring. Your movement is clumsy, a kind of dragging belly crawl, using your limbs to push and pull. Your body flexes. It's exhausting, but you cover distance, explore new territory. You find arthropods, centipede, millipede, early insect. You catch them, eat them, discover that land has food, abundant food, and no competitor. You're the only vertebrate here. Everything else, the arthropods, the plants, evolved here on land. But you're the first vertebrate to exploit this resource. Over the following days, you become more confident. You learn to move more efficiently, to conserve moisture, to find shaded places during the heat of the day. You still return to water. You need to wet your skin, to cool down, to escape when danger threatens. But you're spending more time on land, becoming more adapted to terrestrial life. You're a pioneer, an explorer, the first of your kind to truly live on land. Your descendants will refine what you're learning, will evolve better locomotion, better moisture conservation, better ways of thriving in this environment. But you're the beginning, the brave individual who ventured into the unknown and survived. This is speculative, of course. We can't know the exact experience of any individual ancient tetrapod, but the fossil record tells us that this transition happened, that early tetrapods like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were living in shallow water, venturing onto land, developing the adaptations necessary for terrestrial life. We even have fossil evidence of their footprint, tetrapod trackways from the Devonian period, preserved in ancient mudflats, showing where these creatures walked, how they moved, where they were exploring. The earliest known tetrapod trackways date from about 395 million years ago, from Poland, predating the body fossils of definitive tetrapods by about 10 million years. These tracks show footprints with separate digits, clear evidence of limbs capable of supporting the body and propelling it forward on land. This is remarkable because it tells us that tetrapods, or at least tetrapod-like animals capable of walking on land, appeared earlier than we knew from body fossils. It suggests that the transition to land was happening throughout the Middle and Late Devonian, with multiple lineages experimenting with terrestrial locomotion, with some leaving tracks that fossilized, even though their bones haven't been found, or haven't been recognized as tetrapods. These trackways are windows into behavior, into how ancient tetrapods moved, where they went, what they were doing. The tracks from Poland show an animal walking through mudflats, possibly near a lagoon or estuary. The gait is somewhat sprawling, with legs extending to the side rather than directly underneath the body, similar to modern salamanders or crocodile. The tracks show that the animal could walk continuously, could cover distance, wasn't just flopping around helplessly. This suggests functional limb, muscles capable of supporting and moving the body, a nervous system coordinated enough to control quadrupedal locomotion. Other trackways from later in the Devonian and into the Carboniferous show increasing sophistication, straighter paths, less sprawling gaits, larger animal. The tracks document the evolutionary refinement of terrestrial locomotion, showing how tetrapods became better and better at moving on land. What's particularly interesting is that many of these trackways show the animal going to and from water, following shorelines, crossing tidal flat. They suggest animals that were still primarily aquatic, but were regularly venturing onto land, using terrestrial environments for feeding, travel, possibly escaping predators. This amphibious lifestyle, this living between two worlds, persisted for millions of years. Early tetrapods didn't suddenly become fully terrestrial. They remained tied to water for much of their life, breeding in water, escaping danger in water, perhaps feeding primarily in water. Land was a supplement, an additional habitat, a way to exploit resources and reduce competition. Only later, in the Carboniferous and Permian periods, did some tetrapod lineages become truly terrestrial, capable of living their entire lives on land, breeding on land, independent of water except for drinking. This required additional adaptation, better skin to prevent water loss, eggs that could develop out of water, kidneys that could conserve water, more efficient lungs, and circulation. But the Devonian tetrapods, the pioneers like Tiktaalik and Acanthostega, laid the groundwork. They proved it was possible, demonstrated that vertebrates could survive on land, established the basic body plan that all later tetrapods would inherit and modify. Let's talk about what the world they found on land was like, what this ancient terrestrial environment looked like, what opportunities and challenges it presented. The late Devonian land was unlike any terrestrial environment today. The plants were different. No flowering plants, no grasses, no familiar trees. Instead, there were primitive vascular plants, ferns, early seed plants, and especially lycopsids and early tree-like plants such as Archaeopteris. These plants didn't form dense closed canopy forests like modern tropical rainforests. Instead, they created more open woodlands with scattered trees and extensive areas of low-growing vegetation. The tallest trees reached perhaps 30 meters, impressive for the time, but creating a forest canopy that was more broken, allowing more light to reach the ground than in modern forests. The soil was thin, poorly developed compared to modern soils. Soil formation depends partly on biological activity, plant roots breaking up rock, organic matter decomposing, organisms churning and mixing. In the Devonian, these processes were still relatively new, still developing. The soil that existed was often sandy or silty, unstable, prone to erosion. Water was abundant in many regions, at least seasonally. Rivers meandered across floodplains, creating complex networks of channels, ponds, wetlands. During wet seasons, water covered extensive areas. During dry seasons, it retreated, leaving mudflats and isolated pools. This seasonal variation created dynamic habitat, places where aquatic and terrestrial environments mixed and shifted. The climate was warm, generally warmer than today, without polar ice cap. In the equatorial and tropical regions, where most tetrapod fossils have been found, temperatures would have been consistently high, probably rarely dropping below 20 degrees C, even at night, often reaching 30 to 35 degrees C during the day. This warmth was advantageous for ectothermic animals like early tetrapods, which depended on environmental heat to maintain their body temperature. But the atmosphere was slightly different. Oxygen levels in the Devonian were probably similar to today, perhaps slightly higher by the late Devonian. This high oxygen content may have facilitated the evolution of air-breathing animals, making the transition from water to air easier because oxygen was abundant and readily available. Carbon dioxide levels were higher than today, perhaps 10-15 times current level, contributing to the warm greenhouse climate. This high CO2 would have affected plant growth, making photosynthesis more efficient, driving the expansion of vegetation that characterized the Devonian. The terrestrial food web in the late Devonian was simple compared to modern ecosystems. At the base were the plant, the primary producers, converting sunlight and CO2 into organic matter. Feeding on the plants were arthropods, primitive insects, millipedes eating dead plant matter, centipedes, early arachnids. These arthropods were the primary consumers, and they were abundant. Without vertebrate predators, the tetrapods were just arriving. The arthropods had radiated into many niches, some growing to large sizes. By the later Carboniferous, just after the period we're discussing, arthropods would include giants like Arthropleura, millipede-like creatures over 2 meters long, and Meganeura, dragonfly-like insects with wingspans of 70 centimeters. Predators among the arthropods included early spiders, scorpions, which had moved from water to land earlier than vertebrates, centipedes, and predatory insects. These creatures hunted other arthropods, creating a complex web of predator-prey relationships. But there were no vertebrate predators on land, no amphibians hunting, no reptiles, no mammals or birds. All of these would come later. The land was, from a vertebrate perspective, empty of competition. Any vertebrate that could successfully exploit this environment would have access to abundant food with minimal competition. This is probably one of the major factors driving the transition to land. In the water, competition was intense. Predators were abundant and dangerous. Food was contested. On land, for a vertebrate capable of breathing air and moving effectively, there was a relative paradise, abundant food, few competitors, no predators, except for large arthropods that themselves might become prey. Imagine being one of the first tetrapods to realize this, to venture far enough onto land to discover the feast waiting there. You're surrounded by millipedes, slow-moving, numerous, nutritious. You can eat them with minimal effort, with no other vertebrates competing. The insects are quick, but small, catchable with a fast tongue or jaws. Even the larger arthropods, the predatory centipedes and scorpions, are vulnerable vulnerable to a creature with jaws powerful enough to crack their exoskeleton. You feed extensively, grow larger than you ever could in the water where food was scarce and predators dangerous. You spend days on land, returning to water only to moisten your skin, to escape the heat of midday, to breed. Your offspring, laid in water as eggs, hatch as aquatic larvae with gills, just like your ancestors. But as they grow, they develop lungs, develop limbs, venture onto land just as you did. Over generations, over thousands of years, your lineage becomes more terrestrial. Natural selection favors individuals who can stay on land longer, who move more efficiently, who can conserve moisture better. The genetic variations that provide these advantages become more common. Slowly, gradually, your descendants become true land animals, spending more time on land than in water, exploiting the terrestrial environment more fully. This is the story of the early tetrapods, the pioneers who discovered land and claimed it for vertebrates, who transformed from aquatic to terrestrial animals, who established the lineages that would eventually produce all terrestrial vertebrates, including us. But the transition wasn't easy, wasn't quick, and it required solving multiple challenges simultaneously. Let's examine these challenges one by one, understanding what problems tetrapods had to overcome to become successful land animals. First, locomotion. Moving on, land is fundamentally different from swimming. In water, buoyancy supports your body weight. Resistance from water helps you generate thrust. Yet you push against water with fins or body movements, and the water's resistance provides forward motion. The body can be relatively flexible, muscles arranged for undulating movement. On land, there's no buoyancy. Gravity pulls your body down, and you must support your full weight on your limbs. There's no water resistance to push against. You must push against solid ground, which requires different muscle arrangement, different skeletal structures. The body needs rigidity in some places for support, and flexibility in others for movement. Early tetrapods solved this gradually. Their limbs developed from fins, becoming progressively stronger, more capable of bearing weight. The bones thickened. The joints became more robust. The muscles attached to the bones changed in arrangement to provide the leverage needed for pushing against ground rather than swimming through water. The spine became more rigid, supported by stronger ribs, providing a stable platform for limb movement. In fish, the spine flexes to generate swimming motion. In land animals, the spine must remain relatively stable while the limbs move, requiring different vertebral structures, different muscle attachment. The earliest tetrapods moved with a sprawling gait, limbs extending to the side, body close to the ground. This is similar to how modern salamanders and lizards move. It's not the most efficient method. It requires significant energy, limits speed, but it works, allowing the animal to walk, to move across land, to access terrestrial resources. Later tetrapods evolved more upright postures, with limbs positioned more underneath the body, allowing more efficient locomotion, faster speeds, reduced energy costs. But this took millions of years, many iterations, countless generations of selection. Second, respiration. We've discussed lungs and air breathing, but there's more to terrestrial respiration than just having lungs. You need to prevent your respiratory surfaces from drying out, need to move air efficiently in and out, need to extract sufficient oxygen to support active metabolism. Early tetrapods retained some capacity for cutaneous respiration, gas exchange through the skin. Many modern amphibians rely heavily on this, supplementing lung breathing with oxygen absorbed directly through moist skin. This works, but requires keeping the skin moist, which limits how far from water the animal can venture, how long it can remain. On land, the evolution of more efficient lungs, better ventilation mechanisms, reduced reliance on cutaneous respiration. All of these allowed tetrapods to become more independent of water, to venture further onto land, to remain there longer. Third, desiccation. Water loss is a constant threat for terrestrial animals. Air is typically drier than water, and exposed surfaces, skin, respiratory membranes, eyes, constantly lose moisture through evaporation. Without mechanisms to prevent or minimize water loss, an animal will quickly dehydrate on land. Early tetrapods had moist, permeable skin, similar to modern amphibians. This skin allowed cutaneous respiration, but also allowed rapid water loss. They needed to stay near water, to frequently moisten their skin, to avoid the hottest, driest parts of the day. Later tetrapods evolved better moisture conservation, thicker skin, scales, or other protective coverings, mucus production to keep skin moist, behavioral adaptations like burrowing or seeking shade. But the early pioneers didn't have these refinements. They lived at the edge, constantly balancing the need to breathe air and move on land against the danger of desiccation. Fourth, sensory perception. The sensory world on land is very different from in water. Vision works differently. Light travels further in air. Colors appear more vivid, but the eye must remain moist. Hearing works differently. Sound travels through air, requiring an eardrum and middle ear bones to detect vibration. Smell works differently, detecting airborne chemicals rather than dissolved ones. Early tetrapods had to adapt their sensory systems to function in both water and air. Their eyes needed to work in both environments, requiring a cornea that could focus light in air despite being designed originally for water. Their lateral line system, perfect for detecting water movements, became useless in air, though it remained functional when the animal returned to water. The evolution of an eardrum and middle ear, structures that allow efficient hearing in air, came later. Early tetrapods probably heard poorly on land, relying more on vision and perhaps vibrations detected through the ground. Fifth, temperature regulation. Water has high thermal inertia. It heats and cools slowly, buffering against temperature extreme. An aquatic animal experiences relatively stable temperatures with slow, gradual changes. Land temperatures fluctuate more dramatically, hot during the day, cool at night, varying with weather, season, altitude. Early tetrapods were ectothermic. They relied on environmental heat to maintain their body temperature. On land, this meant they had to behaviorally regulate their temperature, basking in sun to warm up, seeking shade or water to cool down, being active during times when temperatures were optimal. This constraint limited when and where they could be active, made them vulnerable to temperature extremes, reduced their range, but it was workable as modern. Amphibians and reptiles demonstrate behavioral thermoregulation is effective if the animal is smart enough to find appropriate thermal environment. Sixth, reproduction. Most early tetrapods almost certainly reproduced like modern amphibians, laying eggs in water with aquatic larvae that metamorphose into terrestrial adults. This life cycle is called biphasic, with an aquatic phase and a terrestrial phase. Biphasic reproduction tied early tetrapods to water. They could venture onto land, could spend most of their lives there, but they had to return to water to breed. This limited their range, required that suitable aquatic habitat be available, made them vulnerable to predation and competition during the aquatic phase. The evolution of the amniotic egg, an egg that could develop on land, was a major breakthrough that freed later tetrapods from dependence on water for reproduction. But this didn't happen until the Carboniferous period, millions of years after the initial transition to land. Early tetrapods lived with the constraint of biphasic reproduction. Seventh, feeding. Eating on land is different from eating in water. In water, many fish use suction feeding. They rapidly expand their mouth cavity, creating a pressure difference that sucks in water along with prey. This is highly effective in water, but doesn't work in air. On land, animals must use different feeding methods, grabbing prey with jaws, possibly using a tongue to capture or manipulate food, chewing, or crushing food before swallowing. Early tetrapods had to evolve these mechanisms, developing stronger jaw muscle, more complex jaw joints, tongues that could move and manipulate food. The prey was different too. Arthropods with hard exoskeletons rather than soft-bodied fish. This required jaws capable of cracking exoskeleton, teeth suited for gripping and crushing rather than just holding slippery prey. These 7 challenges, locomotion, respiration, desiccation, sensory perception, temperature regulation, reproduction, and feeding, were all interconnected. Progress in one area enabled progress in others. Better locomotion allowed animals to venture further from water, making better moisture conservation more important. Better moisture conservation allowed longer forays onto land, making efficient air breathing more advantageous. The transition to land wasn't a single innovation, but a suite of changes, accumulated over millions of years, refined by natural selection in each generation. The early tetrapods weren't perfect land animals. They retained many aquatic features, many constraints that limited their terrestrial capability, but they were successful enough to survive, to reproduce, to establish populations on land, and crucially, they were first. By the time other groups of vertebrates might have independently evolved terrestrial capability, the tetrapods had already claimed the niche. They had a head start, millions of years to refine their adaptation, to diversify, to establish themselves as the dominant vertebrates on land. This priority effect is important in evolution. The first group to colonize a new environment often has lasting advantages, becoming entrenched, diversifying rapidly, making it harder for later arrivals to compete. The tetrapods' early move onto land gave them an advantage that persists to this day. All terrestrial vertebrates, all amphibian, reptiles, birds, and mammals descend from those early tetrapod pioneers. Let's shift perspective now and consider the broader implications of this transition, what the move to land meant for the history of life, for the development of ecosystems, for the eventual appearance of human. The colonization of land by vertebrates was one of the major events in the history of life, comparable in importance to the origin of life itself, the evolution of photosynthesis, the origin of eukaryotic cells, the evolution of multicellularity. It opened entirely new evolutionary possibilities, new niches, new ways of living. On land, vertebrates diversified explosively. The early tetrapods, by the Carboniferous period, had split into multiple lineages. Some remained amphibious, tied to water, giving rise to modern amphibians, frogs, salamanders, caecilians. Others became more fully terrestrial, evolving the amniotic egg, dry scaly skin, more efficient respiration and circulation. These amniotes split into two major groups, the synapsids, which would eventually produce mammals, and the sauropsids, which would produce reptiles and birds. Both groups diversified extensively, filling terrestrial niches, developing new body plans, new behaviors, new ecological roles. By the Permian period, about 300 to 250 million years ago, land vertebrates included large herbivores, large predators, small insectivores, burrowing forms, gliding forms, an incredible diversity of shapes and sizes and lifestyles. The terrestrial ecosystems were complex, with food webs as intricate as those in the ocean. This diversification was possible because land offered resources and opportunities that weren't available in water. Plant matter was abundant, creating opportunities for herbivores. Insects and other arthropods were numerous, supporting insectivores. The space was three-dimensional. Animals could climb trees, burrow underground, glide, or eventually fly through the air. The evolution of flight, which occurred independently in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats, was only possible on land. Flight in water, or more accurately, flying through water, swimming, is very different from flight in air, requires different structures, different energy budget. The evolution of powered flight in air enabled entirely new lifestyle, new ways of accessing food, escaping predators, migrating across vast distances. The eventual evolution of large size, of animals weighing tons like sauropod dinosaurs or modern elephants, was facilitated by terrestrial life. Large size in water is advantageous because buoyancy supports weight, but extremely large sizes on land require strong skeletal support, powerful muscles, efficient metabolism. The largest land animals are far smaller than the largest marine animals. Blue whales can exceed 100 tons, while the largest land animals, extinct sauropods, probably reached 50 to 80 tons at most. But despite this size limitation, land offered unique opportunities. The diversity of terrestrial environments, forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, tundra, is arguably greater than the diversity of marine environment. Each terrestrial environment presents different challenges, different resources, different opportunities for specialization. This environmental diversity drove evolutionary diversification. Tetrapods adapted to every terrestrial environment, developing specialized features for each. Desert animals evolved water conservation mechanisms, tolerance for temperature extreme, behavioral adaptations for avoiding heat. Arctic animals evolved insulation, hibernation, migration. Mountain animals evolved tolerance for low oxygen, efficiency at extracting energy from poor quality food. This adaptive radiation, this filling of niches, was only possible because tetrapods made the initial transition to land, because they established the basic body plan that could be modified in countless ways for countless lifestyles, and eventually, this radiation produced lineages capable of complex behavior, large brain, intelligence, the evolution of mammals from synapsid ancestors, the diversification of mammals after the extinction of the dinosaur, the evolution of primates, the appearance of human. All of this traces back to those early tetrapods walking onto land in the Devonian period. We exist because they made that journey. If vertebrates had remained entirely aquatic, if the transition to land had never happened or had failed, the evolutionary history of Earth would have been completely different. There might still be complex marine life, possibly even intelligent marine animal, but there would be no land vertebrate, no terrestrial ecosystem as we know them, no human. This contingency, this dependence of the present on specific past event, is a fundamental feature of evolution and history. We are not inevitable. We are the product of a specific sequence of events, any of which could have gone differently. The walk to shore was one of those pivotal events, a moment when history could have branched in other directions, but happened to go the way it did, ultimately leading to us. Let's consider also what we can learn from this transition about evolution more generally, about how major changes happen, about the relationship between organisms and environment. First, the transition to land shows that evolution can cross major ecological boundaries, can move into entirely new environment, but it does so gradually through transitional forms that are viable in their own right. Tiktaalik wasn't trying to become a land animal. 2. It was a successful fish living in shallow water, using its specialized adaptations to thrive in that environment. But those same adaptations pre-adapted it for life on land, made the eventual transition possible. This is a common pattern. Major evolutionary transitions often involve pre-adaptation, features that evolve for one purpose, but turn out to be useful for something completely different. Lungs evolved for breathing in oxygen-poor water, but they enabled life on land. Strong fins evolved for pushing through vegetation, but they became limbs for walking. Scales may have evolved for protection or sensing water flow, but they enabled moisture conservation on land. Evolution doesn't plan ahead, doesn't anticipate future needs. It works with what's available, favoring variations that provide immediate advantages. But sometimes those immediate advantages create possibilities for future transition, for moving into new environment, for developing radically new lifestyle. Second, the transition shows that evolution is opportunistic, exploiting new resources when they become available. The land in the Devonian wasn't empty. It was full of plants and arthropods, but it lacked vertebrate predators, lacked large animals capable of exploiting the terrestrial food web. The first tetrapods to venture onto land found abundant food and minimal competition, driving rapid selection for traits that enhanced terrestrial capability. This pattern repeats throughout evolutionary history. When new environments open up, islands emerging from the ocean, lakes forming in volcanic craters, continents connecting or separating, the organisms that can reach these environments often diversify rapidly, filling empty niches, developing new form. The tetrapod colonization of land is perhaps the most dramatic example, but the pattern is general. Third, the transition shows that major evolutionary changes require solving multiple problems simultaneously. A tetrapod couldn't survive on land with only lungs. It also needed limbs for locomotion, skin that could tolerate air exposure, sensory systems that worked in air. The evolution of these features had to be coordinated, with improvements in one area enabling improvements in others. This coordination doesn't require planning or foresight. It happens naturally through selection. Individuals with better lungs but poor limbs can't exploit land effectively, so they don't leave more offspring than individuals with both good lung and good limb. Selection automatically favors combinations of traits that work well together, creating integrated adaptive packages. Fourth, the transition shows that even major evolutionary changes leave traces, that the past shapes the present in persistent ways. We still carry evidence of our aquatic origin. Our limbs have the same basic bone structure as fish fins. Our ears contain bones that were once part of the jaw. Our embryos develop gill slits that later transform into other structures. We're modified fish, adapted for land, but retaining the fundamental architecture inherited from our aquatic ancestors. This is true throughout biology. Evolution is conservative, modifying existing structures rather than designing new ones from scratch. This leads to quirks, inefficiencies, features that make sense only in light of evolutionary history. But it also creates deep connections, homologies that link all organisms, evidence of common ancestry that we can trace back through time. As we near the end of this journey, let's return one final time to the shores of the Devonian to imagine the experience of those pioneering tetrapods, to appreciate what they accomplished, what they made possible. Picture a shallow tidal flat, muddy and warm, at the edge of a Devonian river. The water is murky, full of sediment, with primitive plants growing thickly in the shallows. The air is humid, heavy with moisture, smelling of vegetation and mud, and the peculiar scent of this ancient world. In the shallows, a Tiktaalik lies motionless, just its eyes above the water, watching. It's watching the shore, where millipedes and other arthropods are moving through the leaf litter, feeding on decaying plant matter. It's hungry, and the fish in the deeper water are wary, hard to catch. Slowly, carefully, it begins to move. It pushes with its strong pectoral fins, feeling the mud beneath. propelling itself into shallower water. The water becomes so shallow that its back breaks the surface. It continues, dragging itself forward, using its fins as levers, its body flexing, tail providing some thrust, even in the minimal water. It reaches the shore, its body now almost entirely out of water. This is uncomfortable. Gravity pulls heavily. The air is drying its skin, but the millipede is close, within reach. It lunges, jaws snapping closed on the arthropod. Success. It swallows, feeling the food slide down its throat. Then it rests, breathing air through its lungs, feeling the oxygen flow, looking out at this strange terrestrial world. For a moment, it stayed, not immediately returning to water. It looks around with its elevated eye, seeing things differently in air, sharper, brighter, the distances more apparent. It hears differently too, not the muffled sounds of underwater, but the clarity of air, the rustling of vegetation, the buzzing of primitive insects. This world is alien, uncomfortable, challenging, but it's also full of opportunity, full of food, empty of competitor. And somehow, in its small brain, in its behavioral programming, something registers. This is viable. This is possible. This could be home. It doesn't make a conscious decision to become a land animal. It doesn't envision its descendants walking on land, breathing air exclusively, conquering terrestrial environment. It just lives, just does what works, just exploits the opportunities available. But its descendants will go further. They'll spend more time on land, develop better adaptation, become more capable. Generation after generation, the traits that enhance terrestrial life will be favored, will become more common. The body will change, gradually, from fish-like to tetrapod-like, from aquatic to amphibious to terrestrial. And millions of years later, hundreds of millions of years later, some of those descendants will be completely terrestrial, will have forgotten their aquatic origins, will walk and run and climb and fly, will build civilization, will look back through time and see this moment, this tiktaalik on the shore, and understand this is where it began. This is where we began. This is the walk to shore, the leaving of the ocean behind, the journey that made everything else possible. You are descended from that tiktaalik, from those early tetrapods, from the brave individuals, not consciously brave, but effective, successful, surviving, who ventured onto land and found a way to live. Your arms and legs are modified fins. Your lungs are modified swim bladder. Your entire body is an aquatic design adapted for terrestrial life. When you walk, when you breathe, when you use your hands to manipulate objects, you're using structures that evolved initially for a completely different purpose in a completely different environment. You're a fish out of water, quite literally, a descendant of fish who made that transition so successfully that you've forgotten your aquatic heritage, that you think of yourself as a land animal, as something fundamentally different from fish. But the connection is real, traceable through fossils, through comparative anatomy, through genetics. You carry the ocean within you, in your blood, which has salt concentrations similar to seawater, in your cells, which maintain internal environments reminiscent of the ancient seas, in your genes, which contain instructions inherited from aquatic ancestors, modified over millions of years, but never completely rewritten. The walk to shore was not just a physical journey. It was an evolutionary journey, a transformation that took millions of years, countless generations, innumerable individual lives. It was a journey of adaptation and innovation, of trial and error, of survival and extinction, of gradual modification of ancient structure for new purposes. And it was a journey that continued. Evolution hasn't stopped. Tetrapods continue to evolve, to adapt to changing environment, to develop new capability. Humans are part of this ongoing process, though we now shape our evolution through culture and technology, as well as through natural selection. The walk to shore reminds us where we came from, how we got here, what we are. We're not separate from nature, not exempt from evolutionary history, not designed by any external intelligence. We're products of natural process, of evolution, of the same forces that shaped Tiktaalik and every other organism. But we're also unique in our own way. We're the only species, as far as we know, capable of understanding our own evolutionary history, of tracing our origins back through time, of appreciating the journey our ancestors made from water to land. We can look at fossils like Tiktaalik and see not just extinct animals, but our own relatives, our own ancestors, the pioneers who made our existence possible. This knowledge should inspire both humility and wonder. Humility, because we're part of nature, products of blind processes, not the pinnacle of creation or the purpose of existence. Wonder, Because despite the lack of plan or purpose, evolution has produced us, has generated beings capable of understanding, of contemplating, of caring about the history that produced them. As you go about your life, as you walk and breathe and live on land, remember occasionally that you're a fish out of water, a descendant of aquatic pioneers, an heir to the walk to shore. Remember that your ability to live on land, to thrive here, to build civilizations and explore the universe all traces back to those early tetrapods who first ventured onto shore, who first took breath of air on land, who first walked on ancient beaches. They were small, simple creatures, probably not very bright, certainly not aware of the significance of what they were doing, but they were brave in their own way, not consciously brave, but evolutionarily brave, doing something new, something difficult, something that would transform the history of life. They left the ocean behind, not because they wanted to, but because they could, because circumstances favored it, because the traits they possessed made it possible, and in doing so, they opened a new chapter in Earth's history, a chapter that would eventually include dinosaurs and mammals and birds, forests and grasslands and tundra, and ultimately us, conscious beings, standing on land, breathing air, marveling at the journey that brought us. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for walking alongside those ancient pioneers, for appreciating the transformation they underwent, the challenges they overcame, the legacy they left. May this knowledge connect you to your deep past, to the ancient fish within you, to the ongoing story of life on Earth. Rest well, breathing the air that your ancestors learned to breathe, standing on the land they learned to walk, grateful for the journey that made you possible, connected to all tetrapods, past and present, all of us descendants of those brave pioneers who made the walk to shore.